now we're going to talk about elections, voting, and election law. While federal elections include elections for members of the House of Representatives and the Senate, the most important election occurs every 4 years, the presidential election. And voters in states across the country go to the polls every 2 years. At these elections, they'll vote for both federal and state government to reduce the total electoral expenses. And so election costs have increased significantly over time. Today, election costs include massive marketing campaigns, staffing, travel expenses, and outreach to the voting public. Marketing includes printed materials, radio and TV advertising, direct phone campaigns, and online efforts. These costs are funded by the political party and campaign donations both to the candidate directly and to 527 groups. Electoral costs run into the millions of dollars, particularly for major Senate and presidential elections. Members of the House serve 2-year terms, so elections for the House occur in each electoral cycle. Senators are elected for a 6-year period. However, the seats are not filled at the same time. The presidential election occurs every 4 years on the Tuesday after the first Monday of the month of November. And while voting rights were not set out in the Constitution, they have been clarified by the U.S. Supreme Court in many different verdicts. Voting rights include access to the polls, either in person or by mail, district distribution, and laws regarding recounts. These voting rights laws apply to all elections, including presidential and midterm elections. And there are just a couple basic facts to know about House and Senate campaigns and elections. Remember that senators run statewide, where members of the House are elected by a particular district. Gerrymandering or the redrawing of districts can increase the likelihood of a particular party or candidate winning. And incumbents typically win with a particularly strong advantage in the House. Some may run unopposed, for example, where members in the House, the incumbent advantage is around 90%, with only 10% of incumbents losing the election. Significantly fewer votes are cast in midterm elections or those occurring outside of the presidential election cycle. There are no term limits for representatives or senators, and members of the House and Senate are elected directly by the people by a majority vote. Presidential candidates must, by law, be 35 years of age, be a native-born U.S. citizen, or the child of 2 U.S. citizens born outside the United States. The president must also have lived in the U.S. for 14 years. However, this requirement is vague and has never been challenged. Some presidents, like Eisenhower, spent a number of years outside the U.S. There is no upper age limit, and the president may have lived outside the U.S. for personal or professional reasons. Candidates most often have political experience. They may have served as senators or state governors prior to their candidacy, but this is not required by either party or by the Constitution. In recent years, President Clinton and President George W. Bush were former governors, while U.S. President Barack Obama was a senator from Illinois prior to his election. Candidates often present themselves as Washington outsiders in order to distance themselves from political conditions in the nation's capital. In many cases, governors or senators step down from their offices before beginning their campaign. However, this is also not required. Incumbent presidents or current vice presidents running for president continue their regular duties during their presidential campaign. And I'm actually real quick going to switch slides to an old presentation that we did that should kind of tie into what I'm going to continue to talk about. So let's get to the timeline. Okay. While the U.S. and Senate elections are relatively straightforward, presidential elections are much less so. The electoral process begins when the candidate declares their candidacy. This typically occurs around 18 months before the next presidential election, and candidates begin campaigning at this time, particularly in states where there are early or influential primaries, like New Jersey and Iowa. Early in the presidential campaign, there are multiple candidates for the party nomination of both the Democratic and Republican parties, and these candidates make personal visits and begin large-scale campaigns to illustrate their platform. Early in the election year, the primaries begin, and New Hampshire holds the first, followed by the caucus in Iowa and in February. And some 39 of 50 states hold presidential primaries. A number of states are moving their primaries to earlier in the calendar year in order to gain additional influence. Many southern states hold their primaries on the same day in March, called Super Tuesday. And primaries are controlled by the states and may vary in how they are managed, who may vote, and which candidates are allowed on ballots. In many states, primaries are closed and only registered members of a party may vote. In these closed primaries, Republican voters choose their preferred Republican candidate, while Democratic voters do the same for the Democratic Party. Independent voters or unregistered voters may not vote in these closed primary elections. In an open primary, voters may vote in whichever party primary they prefer, regardless of their affiliation. The least common option, the blanket primary, allows voters to choose one candidate per office, regardless of party. Primaries are not only held for presidential elections, but others as well. The individual who receives a plurality of votes in the primary election will receive the state's support at the party convention. In the summer of the election year, the two political parties each hold a convention and choose their presidential nominee and set forth the party's platform for the next 4 years. And since the middle of the 20th century, the party not currently in power holds their convention first, followed by the incumbent's party. Voters may also choose party delegates at the primary election, depending on the state. Party delegates are party delegates who go to the party convention and help to choose the final candidate for the presidency often vary. They are typically members of the local Democratic or Republican Party. The Democratic Party also invites all representatives and senators to the party conventions as superdelegates. While voting occurs at the convention, the outcome of the party nomination is typically well known on the basis of the primary election and caucuses. In more recent years, non-winning candidates typically bow out of the process prior to the convention and then offer their support to the winning candidate. A large number of convention attendees are not delegates, and the Democratic convention has far more delegates than the Republican. Today, these conventions are large enough that they typically take place in major sports arenas of all things. So following the convention, the election has narrowed to only 2 presidential candidates. While the candidates were most interested in loyal party members during the primary season, the most appealing voters during this phase of the campaign are the independent or swing voters. Loyal party members will typically vote for their party's candidates regardless of other factors. Many centrists or moderate voters will choose between party candidates, and candidates may take more moderate positions to appeal to these voters during the final months of the election season. The other significant effort during the last months of the campaign is for voter turnout. The U.S. has one of the lowest voter turnouts among democratic nations. Working to increase voter turnout can impact an election significantly. Voting rates are typically highest among older people and lowest among younger people. Improved efforts to encourage younger voters can increase turnout at the polls and votes for candidates who may appeal to a different demographic. Candidates have to consider both the popular vote and the Electoral College. Designed by the Founding Fathers, the Electoral College is the final deciding vote in the presidential election. The Founding Fathers were not comfortable with the direct election of president. There was limited access to info, and the population was largely uneducated. They also chose not to have Congress select or elect the president, concerned with giving too much power to the federal government. The Electoral College was the solution to this problem. It's made up of representatives from every state, with the number being determined by the number of senators and representatives from each state. Each elector would originally cast a vote for a president and a vice president. Today, members of the Electoral College cast their vote for the winner of the popular vote, but in all but 2 states, the majority vote takes all delegate votes. This can create a situation in which the popular vote and the electoral vote differ. For instance, in 2000, Al Gore won the national vote because George Bush became president based on the number of electoral votes. Because of the Electoral College, swing states, or those in which the vote could go to one candidate or the other, are of particular importance to candidates. In order to win the presidency, the candidate must get at least 270 electoral votes. The election is decided by the Electoral College. However, no candidate receives 270. Should no candidate receive 270, the House of Representatives makes the final choice. The House elected the president in 1800 and in 1824, but has not at any time since. Isn't that fascinating? And then this PowerPoint that I'm flying through already has a video that goes into much more detail and depth than I just talked about. Okay, we've seen we've seen political participation questions. So remember, the higher than average education levels are more likely to vote. Young people are less likely to vote. Older people are more likely to vote. Minorities are usually underrepresented. Women participate at a slightly higher rate than men. Married people are also more likely to vote, and government employees have high levels of participation. Kind of common sense, kind of duh, but